Hello everyone, this is Marcel and welcome to my channel. When I was working the other day, I had a colleague tell me a rather heart-wrenching story. He said that his wife had told him after their several years in marriage that she was going away. She left him with her children, his children at this point, not by blood. So essentially he was raising some other guy's kids. Left him and her entire family to go off to what he described as the big city, didn't specify where. I don't want to get into too many details, but she's basically out there checking off her bucket list. She's living her life and accomplishing her goals. There are three things about his story that struck me as very odd. And the first and most obvious is that she left her kids with him. That's unusual for women. Normally they keep a death grip on their kids, understandably. But all the same, she actually abandoned them with him to go off and do this. Second thing she told him that's strange is that if he were to try and divorce her during her hiatus while she was gone, that she would go after him in court and would take everything he owns. Now, naturally, that happens quite often, but the fact that she was blunt and direct with it is kind of a surprise. The third thing that shocked me was the general oblivious nature that this guy had towards the situation. You see, otherwise, he's an intelligent, educated, straightforward individual. He's a really cool guy. He is also the world's cheapest long-term babysitter. See, by preventing him from divorcing her or discouraging it, she can return at any time she wants and basically reclaim those children, and there's pretty much nothing he can do about it unless he records the entire situation and really gets his ducks in a row. He and I sat down for a good half hour and discussed the situation. I gave him as many pointers as I could come up with on how to turn things around into his favor. Start off with things like taking notes down on everything she does, recording conversations, getting valuable property out of his name since she had actively threatened to take it. None of it suggesting that he leave his family or anything. All of it in the context of, if you do this, you might also want to do this. I try to give people in situations like that options and outcomes rather than advice. I come across stories like this almost every day. The reasons why people get married are usually straightforward and understandable. Not to say they're always the smartest, but the reasons for their marriage demise can get intricate and very devastating. Now, in my entire life, I can count only a very few number of times I have seen functioning marriages that have lasted more than, say, 20 years. It really hasn't been very common. Of those, I can think of several that went through multiple previous marriages to get to that point and still had their complaints. People always have complaints about their lover. I will say the ones that lasted the longest seemed to have something of a sense of a working relationship. Very little romance, but they functioned extremely well together. As I recall, they were also in their 60s and 70s and likely from a generation that's long gone. At least when compared to modern times, that is. So did the concept of marriage change over time, or did the people just change? The purpose of the marriage itself, within the context of the two individuals considering it, should be taken very seriously, but more often than not, it isn't the case. Usually they fumble into the idea blindly like a dog chasing a car. Once they catch it, they have no clue what to actually do with it. They get overwhelmed and stuff starts to unravel out of control. Thing is, if you sift away all the other details, break it down to its fundamentals, in modern times, marriage is simply a trap for the guy. Even in the cases where a religion inspires the initial idea of marriage, which I think would be the biggest argument against my stance on it, it doesn't mean that its intended purpose isn't going to get corrupted shortly down the road. Being in huge groups of guys in a military setting, for example, where you spend long hours working together over periods of months, even years, you would be amazed at the stories you'll hear, the things that go on behind the scenes. See, when a bunch of guys, or even women in some cases, are around each other that long, they can't keep up the charade forever. The truth eventually comes out. Nobody likes to admit or acknowledge the fact that they've made a mistake, and certainly something as sacred and important as marriage is not the first thing they would ever admit to, in that respect at least. Come to think of it, over the thousands of marriage-related conversations I've had over the years, kind of scrolling through them in my mind, I really can't remember many of them where the guy looked back on it positively as a good decision. After the so-called honeymoon, they gravitate into a more realistic view of it, one in which their attitude is somewhere between passively acknowledging that it's there all the way to outright regret. Kind of goes to show, at least on a subliminal level, even the most blue-pilled of men knows, at least to a degree, that he's made a mistake. Those who would openly say otherwise are generally referring to a different accomplishment that has more to do with the act of getting married as opposed to the marriage itself. Say, for example, he did it for his family's honor or to take care of the kids, build a home for them, stuff like that. My own personal experience with marriage was pretty much the same. I tried it once and learned the first time. I feel pretty foolish looking back on it, too. I had numbers of different, even women, telling me, "Do not marry her, Marcel. Stay away from her, don't date her, get away from her, I've had them actually refer to my ex as being a vampire, which caught me off guard, and the random friend that said it, I never expected her to, but they had her pegged, even from a distance. You know, people warned me. Other women warned me. Didn't listen. In the end, it came down to stubbornness. In my case, you see, my ex had told me that I didn't take the relationship seriously. She kind of challenged me to prove myself without actually saying it. And initially, when I suggested the idea of marriage, she turned it down. She wasn't interested. And I had to kind of convince her into it. Well, it was a long-term game on her part. By having to fight her into the idea of it, she made me do all of the work for her in the process. And everything that everyone ever told me about that woman was true. In the fact that she was using me, that she was taking advantage of me, that she would never treat me how I deserved, but I didn't listen to any of it. And I think that the reasons males make the decisions that we do, it comes down to our own drive. Motivated people like men get things done, and it's not difficult to contort that to ultimately suiting the girl's needs. Would you believe that even her own sister walked up to me and said, "Marcel, why in the world would you marry that woman?" Now, of course, that's a horrible thing to say about family, and I promptly shamed her for it, and she apologized. But looking back on it, she was trying to warn me. Secret is, my ex had flawlessly tapped into the things that would cause me to behave the way that she wanted. Goes to show, for every man, no matter how determined or strong-minded, there is the perfect polar opposite woman, the reflection of him, waiting to take advantage of him somewhere. Even the most romantic philosophers, forgiving the term, the people out there that say there's the perfect match for everyone, should be willing to admit that the inverse of that is true as well. Something along the lines of the perfect toxic match. Anybody remember that old 2008 superhero comedy, Hancock, starring Will Smith? Wasn't the greatest movie, but it embodies my point perfectly. Spoilers ahead. So essentially, he is a superhero. He's got, these godlike powers. He can run around the world and save people, and that's basically what he does. But when all these superheroes were created, they had kind of a perfect match made with them, for them. And whenever they get together, they lose all of their powers, their immortality, their super strength, their flight. It all goes away so that they can kind of settle down and start a family. And that becomes their only purpose when they're together. But if they separate, they get their powers back. Well, he's running around saving all these people and, doing a shitty Will Smith kind of job at it. And eventually he comes across this woman who changes everything. Little does he know, he had like a brain trauma previously and lost all of his memory, couldn't remember his life and his past, didn't know that that was his wife the whole time, his soulmate. When she caught on that he had knocked his head, she took off and decided to leave him and have a life of her own, have her own thing, and live forever and experience what she wanted. Well, he came across her randomly by chance and started to reconnect and lose all of his powers. Men have all these superpowers. We have all this potential. We have all these opportunities ahead of us. And we can excel and do all of this stuff up until the point when we lose all of them and sacrifice all of it More like it gets taken from us so that we can start a family. That becomes the only purpose. Maybe that wouldn't be so bad in of itself if the woman wasn't just waiting for any opportunity when the guy knocks his head and she can run off. No way to really know for sure whether or not that's his other half or his kryptonite. Thing is, if she really truly was his perfect other half, she would probably want him to excel with his life and not tie him down, not completely crush his destiny. At least that feels like what a loving person would do. A genuine one, anyway. I just thought that was kind of an interesting comparison. Marriage, above all else, is a contract. One in which there's a party that is not penalized in any way for breaking it, and is actually given incentives for doing so, and opportunities to sign more contracts to the same ends. There are virtually no social or cultural repercussions to a woman who ends a marriage. Generally, she's commended for her initiative and strength. Then she's granted the support of the guy regardless. The men who get married and somehow manage to keep it afloat for long enough wind up having to work remarkably hard to do so, and sometimes even that's not enough. Like many other things, for example, romance, sex, it should be mutually beneficial where both parties contribute. In the end, guys seem to always wind up paying for the privilege. Anyway, I probably ranted about this enough. If you agree, disagree, let me know down below. If you want to hear more content like mine, like, share, subscribe. And until next time, this has been Marcel.